if you have a respiratory system.
How's it going, y'all? This is McFrostyBoy, and today we're going to be focusing on roles and teamwork. Now, last week we talked about functional roles. We mentioned social roles, which is what we'll be covering today. So, as I mentioned before, well, I suppose if you haven't checked out the one on functional roles, you may want to check it out. It does provide some context to the overall conversation. As I mentioned, however, functional roles are... Functional roles are going to be related to like the mechanical things that players do like within the game. Social roles pertain to like how teams make decisions and reach consensus on the course of action, how they proceed. The reason why like you want to think about like you would benefit from thinking about these things is sort of just understanding like where you are as a player, like what your strengths are, and sort of the things that you should focus on trying to provide for your squad instead of like trying to bend yourself into like a weird play style. So we'll go over some of these things and then I'll provide like an example using myself at the end. Help you kind of like understand like sort of like what this all looks like when you put it all together. So when we want to talk about social roles, one of the first things we're actually going to want to focus on, strangely enough, are the individual players themselves and their preferred methods of solving different problems within the game. Specifically, I tend to make a distinction between players that are more cerebral and think heavy with how they solve problems within the game, and players that rely more on their execution. They're not like mutually exclusive, but I think in general, players have like a tendency to prefer one or the other. I mean, they just necessarily are better at like one or the other, and so they like lean more into their strengths in that sense. But like, you know, just because like you're like, you know, like a very cerebral player doesn't mean you can't have like great execution, and just because you have great execution doesn't mean you can't use your brain and make intelligent plays. So, you know, I don't want to by any stretch of the imagination like sort of like try to sell that idea. I don't think that's true. But by like understanding like the understanding that like players have like different preferences, right? They like it means like that certain types of problems within the game like they're better equipped to solve because their default method of thinking is going to like lean towards that. Which so like, you know, like for example, right, like a player that is like, you know, very heavy on like, you know, like very cerebral heavy, you know, like they're like going to be really great at finding creative ways to manipulate cover or the map or, you know, the positioning of teams in order to like, you know, bring more successful situations for themselves. So they'll probably be showing up from angles that enemies aren't expecting to, creating situations like where they've got like really like lethal team fire set up, like that sort of stuff. Whereas execution heavy base players aren't going to think as much, like they're not going to spend as much time deliberating, and they're going to respond much more quickly. And so they're like, there's benefits to, you know, both playstyles, and honestly, like I think diversity of playstyles is like really useful for teams. You know, helps them just like have flexibility when it comes to like solving problems, and just like, you know, like being open to like sort of like the different things that each playstyle is going to need definitely is of benefit to the squad. So now we sort of like established the, you know, the cerebral versus like mechanical distinction, right? We mentioned sort of like the types of problems that need solving within the game. I typically break those down into three different categories. And so each of these categories, you know, like someone generally within the squad like will tend to make most of the decisions. And so like when I say like someone's like a decision maker, I usually mean that they will like throw out like, you know, like they'll be the first person to throw out an idea, and the squad like may take it back, and they may like have feedback on the idea, right? They may be like, I think that's a bad idea, or like I don't think we should do that, or blah blah blah. And then like once consensus is reached, it's like usually like expected like that person like will like iterate on that idea and be like, okay, so like they're like, what about this? Or they're like, or they'll just say like, yeah, let's do that. If like an alternative idea was thrown out. Pretty simple stuff. So in like the three, and so like, you know, like the whole thing is though, is like the, you know, that burden of decision making doesn't generally get at least in my experience, has not generally been placed upon a single player in all contexts, because it's just, there's a lot of different things that you need to think about within the game and a lot of different problems that need solving. And so, you know, having like one person do all of that for a squad, it's like a lot of pressure for that individual, and I think it's just like it's not natural, because it doesn't really, like, you know, recognize that like players just have like different strengths of problem solving. So the first context is, you know, I'll start from at the top down, right? Like, so the first context is like macro strategy, is the macro strategy context, and so this is like at like a very high level, like the, like, you know, knowing like, you know, the rotations on the map and like where squads are, resource management, trying to think like what else, understanding like where squads are, like trying to shape like your endgame fight, like all those sorts of like concerns, like that's like the sort of stuff that you'll see you know, occupying the focus largely with when it comes to macro strategy. Okay, so the next context that is like up for consideration is like the tactical context. And so this is like, you know, like more granular than like macro strategy. This is like sort of like the things that squads do, like the coordinated maneuvers they make within the fight, like, or within a fight. So that might mean like, you know, it's like making the decision to use the like a horizontal in a certain way, or to attack from a certain angle, to contest a building, to set up a flank, like those sorts of things. So generally speaking, you know, like the squad may overall deliberate like on how they want to do that, but eventually, like once like, you know, like the time factor comes in, like, you know, usually like one player is going to be sort of like making suggestions on what to do next. And so the third and final context is the execution context. And so this is like literally moment to moment, like instant to instant decision making. And so I think the clearest example of this context is actually going to be when it comes to target prioritization. And actually, this is like the one of the roles that like ties in like most strongly to like a preferred playstyle. In terms of like the problem solving that we mentioned earlier. And so like this, you know, like the particular case that like I think a lot of people may be familiar with is target prioritization. And so the players that are, you know, like more mechanically like favor their mechanical execution over sort of like cerebral problem solving are going to, generally speaking, be running in that point position that we mentioned in our functional rules video. And so that means that they're going to be like the, you know, first to the door, and they're going to be first taking shots, and so they'll be calling out damage first also. And so in those situations, there's actually so little time for squads to deliberate that it's like they just need to operate on like whatever information they have. And so I guess like just by default, you know, because like they're making the damage call outs first, like the point person is the one that's like making the decisions.
Need to recharge my shields.
So like, you know, if you and your squad were like all pushing a building together, you know, then like, you know, like your execution decision maker might be calling out, you know, like big damage on like, you know, like Gibby or whoever, right? And so then when your squad arrives there, like they should follow that target prioritization in order to, you know, be as efficient with their damage as they possibly can be. What's important to remember, like in all of these, like different, like, you know, even though they're like all these different contexts, is that like, and like, you know, like there's generally like a decision maker in each context. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's like, you know, this person's like word is like law, right? So it's like some squads may like be a little bit more flexible, and so, you know, like, you know, that all squad members may collaborate, and like other squads may be just like they just want that one person to make the decisions, and they don't even want to think in those contexts about those things, and they just like completely want to like offload that responsibility and purely like focus on just like, you know, fulfilling like the plan that person lays out because they just got that degree of trust in that person, which is like totally fine. Also, like it really comes down to like level of comfort as a squad, and like what makes the most sense for everyone involved. Which is just, people are different, and so it's like different from squad to squad. And so like, and again, like also as I mentioned, like it may be that like, all three of like, these decision maker roles may be filled by the same person. Typically the deciding factor is going to be like the actual like magnitude like of skill. So I like, as I mentioned, it's like that players like may prefer to be like more cerebral and think heavy, or more execution heavy, like when it comes to solving problems. Well, it's like, if just objectively speaking, like, like a player is like better than their teammates, like in all of those categories, then they may actually just be better equipped to make decisions overall for the squad. And it'll be better if like they just put all of that decision making responsibility on that one person instead of distributing it out across the squad, which may be like a little bit more ideal. Like, if like if all squad members were relatively equal but just different in skill distribution. So like, a pretty easy example is, if you like compare, like myself to someone that like some of you who have been like watching for a while have seen me play with a pretty fair chunk Pepega aim. And so like Pepega aim, right, like is like, past masters level player, and like on all fronts is just like a better player, right? I'm fine with admitting that. I really hope he doesn't watch this one because I swear he's gonna rub it in my face, and I always hate it when he does that. But yeah, so it's like on all fronts, right? Like his decision making, like under pressure generally is, I would consider it to like be more sound than my own. His execution is definitely like superior to my own. And like tactically, I trust him to like make like reasonable suggestions on like how to proceed like quickly, and I think like is less likely to make like errors in judgment than I am. So like for like all of those reasons, right? Like it's like I like generally just hand over most decision-making capacity, like in all contexts, to Pepega. But that doesn't mean like that like I like totally shut my brain off, because like I mentioned, like I'm, generally like a player that does like tend to like prefer like, cerebral type playstyle. And so I do have like ideas and like input to offer, like when it comes to like solving like, some of like our, macro strategic problems, as well as some of like our tactical problems, right? So, like I'll often like, make suggestions or like throw out ideas, but I'm like always looking to Pepega for confirmation, right? And so that's like sort of like the deciding factor there, like in like what like leads me to say that like, I consider Pepega in general in most contexts to be like the decision makers, because in most contexts I'm like looking to him for confirmation that that is like a plan of action that he feels is like reasonable and is willing to follow.